So we've already checked for roles, but what happens if we want to check if a user has specific permission to do something? Now in this part, we're going to implement the ability to give a user an individual permission. And then in the next part, we're going to be looking at how to check if a user has permission to do something, but through a role, as we saw in the introduction. So let's start out by just creating over in the database a example permission, and then we'll go ahead and look at how we might implement this method. So again, let's say something like edit posts. We might not have the ability to edit posts, but we're going to give a specific permission to this user to edit posts. So over in users permissions, again, we create a record for this, and we'll be implementing the methods to actually give a user permission as well. So you won't have to do these all manually. So let's go ahead and select this permission. And now technically this user has permission to edit posts. Now, what we might also do is create another permission. So let's say delete posts. Maybe we don't want to give that user permission to delete posts. So we'll leave that permission in there. We'll check for it, but it should return false. So we've got two that we can test with. Okay, so if we come over, the core of this, of course, is going to go under our has permissions trait. So let's start to think about how we might want to do this. Let's say has permission to, and let's go ahead and again use a variadic function in here to give permission. And in actual fact, I think in this case, it'd probably be better just to give one permission in here and then maybe chain them on. It's going to have the same speed effect, but you can always go ahead and update this later on. So it's entirely up to you. Okay, so what we want to do is eventually check has permission through a role. So I'm going to leave a comment there just so we don't forget. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to extract checking the permission out to another method. So in this case, let's go ahead and say this has permission, and then go ahead and pass that permission in. So we have this that will be exposed and we can use, and then we'll have this which will be protected. So let's go ahead and just implement this down here. And this is just a method has permission, and of course into that we will receive a permission. Okay, so how do we even start to check this? Well, what we can actually do is very simply using the permissions relationship that we already set up. Like I said earlier, this is the kind of core of it. We just say where name, we go ahead and give the name, and then we just say permission name, like so. Now you might be thinking, well, hold on a minute, when we maybe call this has permission to method. So for example, just over here, we could do a die dump and say user has permission to, we're actually passing a string into here. Well, what we're not actually going to be doing is using this method and exposing this method. So in actual fact, this probably could be protected. Now, bear with me for a second because I'm going to explain in just a minute how all of this ties in. So I'm going to go ahead and just finish this off by saying count. All that will do, of course, will check if we actually have a record in the user's permissions relationship, what's returned from that, where the name is the permission name. Now, like I said, we're passing a string into this method. We're passing that string over to has permission, and then we're accessing a name property. So how does this work? Well, what we're actually going to be doing and what we need to do is when we use this, we're going to be using Laravel's can method. And this works with Laravel's authorization, and we can actually set this up to iterate through all permissions and essentially just kind of assign these to users. So bear with me and I'll show you how we do this just now. So we're going to create a service provider for this, and this is going to be the kind of core permission service provider. So let's create a provider, and I'm going to call this permissions service provider or permission service provider, whatever you want to call it. Let's come over to providers. Let's come over to this. We're going to do everything in boot, and this will allow us to use that can method. So let's register this service provider. So let's come over to config and app, just duplicate this one down, and we will set that in there to permission service provider. Okay, so what we are going to do inside of boot is essentially map through all of our permissions. So let's go up the top and use app permission like so, and we're going to say permission get, which will of course grab all of the permissions that we have inside of the permissions table. And then what we want to do is immediately map over them. So we're obviously dealing with a Laravel collection here. We're going to create our closure. For each iteration of this, we're going to have a permission, so we can name that just in there. And now what we want to do is use Laravel's gate. So if we come up here and use the gate facade, we basically just define a permission and essentially just say whether a user has that permission. So to do this, we say gate define, and you can read more about this in the Laravel documentation if you're not too sure, but we're going to say permission name. So we're extracting out the permission name. We're going ahead and inside of here, defining a closure, we will get the currently authenticated user in here. And then what we want to do is use that permission in there. And then within here, all we need to do is return a true or a false based on whether the currently authenticated user can actually or has permission to use this permission or has this permission. So let's go ahead and return user has permission to, which is remember the method that we've just implemented. So has permission to, passing in that permission. So this is now the permission object because we're iterating through all of them. And that's why inside of has permission to over here, we're accepting an object in, passing an object through and extracting the name out. So it's just a way of once a user has kind of hit your page, we always extract out the permissions and we check that for every request a user makes. Very, very important. So now that we've done this, let's go and test this out. So like I said, this has permission to could probably be a protected method. It makes a little bit more sense. So we'll go ahead and we will set that to protected. And let's pull up this public method just up here. I always like to keep the public methods at the top, protected, and then relationships at the bottom. Okay, so now that we've done this, let's just test that this works. So if we just come over to our web roots, we know that we're going to use the can method, which is part of Laravel's authorization. So what we should see now, because we set up our user permission here, I should be able to edit posts. So we should, of course, see a true value. And of course, we have a call to undefined method. And of course, that's protected. So yeah, obviously that should be public. In the kind of flip side, if you wanted to use this on its own, you could pass a permission object through, or you could check if it's a string and then do other things. But for now, I think that's just enough. So you can see now that as I hit the page, we have that permission service provider. It's registering that permission, and then we can go ahead and see that we do have permission. Now, just to kind of test this out, if you were to always return false here, you know that any method or any instance of using the can method is always going to return false. So that's pretty much what we're doing, mapping through all permissions, defining that permission name for that user and checking if that user has permission to do something. So we know that we also have on our permissions table delete posts. So let's go ahead and check this one out, give that a refresh, and we see that's false. But of course, just reverting back to edit posts, we know that that works perfectly. And for checking permissions, that is pretty much it. Of course, we've got a little bit more work to do. We want to be able to check if a user has a permission through role and all of the other stuff that we want to do. But that should give you a good idea as to how you can kind of set this up.